Hello everyone, today I'm going to read chapter 6 of Big Mac's Harem. Something's up with my computer, not sure if it's going to last. Anyways, I'm going to try to record it. Let's hope this is going to be alright. Let's hop right into it. Once again, the days passed by with very little activity worth mentioning. Same as usual, get up, get to work, go to town, and then go back to bed. Things were still awkward between Applejack and Big Mac, and it was all that he could do to avoid his sister. The previous night they had both been stacking the baskets up in the barn so that they would keep dry from the approaching storm, and she had kissed him passionately. Luckily enough, though, Big Mac had just stacked his last basket, so he was able to get up and out of the barn before things became too awkward. Recently, too, he had been visiting Twilight Sparkle at the library. They hadn't had sex, Twilight having told him that she wanted to wait before they did it again, but it was apparent that they were now in a relationship. Twilight had brought up the subject of revealing the relationship to their friends, and ever since then, Big Mac had dreaded the moment when Applejack would find out. He wasn't sure how she would react, and he really didn't want to find out. Would she be angry? She might have been the size of an average mare, but Applejack could beat him down if she wanted to, and she would certainly be able to hurt Twilight. But she'd be sad or heartbroken. He just didn't know. Applejack might have started to develop some kind of feelings for him, other than those of a sibling, and no matter how nervous, angry, or guilty made him feel, Applejack was still his sister and he still cared for her very much. Morning came once again and Big Mac went down to have breakfast with the rest of the Apple family. As usual, it was quiet and quaint as the ponies all tried to get awake and eat up before they got behind schedule. Today though, just before Big Mac finished his food, Granny Smith told him, "I need you to do something different today. The Sisterhood of Social is coming up, and my good saddle is all worn out, loose threads and patchy spots all about." She took a sip of her drink. "I need you to take it down to the nice pony that Applejack is friends with, Rarity, and see if she can fix it up for me." Big Macintosh nodded a little times and chuckled when Apple Bloom piped up, but Granny Smith, why can't I take it?" It was obvious that she wanted to get out of her work today and go see Sweetie Belle. "Hush now, Apple Bloom," Granny Smith replied. "You know what you got to do today. That saddle's bigger than you are, honey. It'd squish you flat." Apple Bloom huffed and poked at her eggs. The Apple family finished up with breakfast, placed their dishes into the sink, and then Applejack and Apple Bloom filed out of the house and went down to start the day. Meanwhile, Big Mac followed Granny Smith up to her room and stood to the side and dodged the flying items that were thrown in his way as she sifted through to find her good saddle. Eventually, she found and then slung it over his back. "Now," Granny Smith began, "if she can fix it today, you can stay down there and then bring it back up here. Ain't no sense in going all the way down there and then coming back up and then going back down there." She adjusted it on his back so that it wouldn't fall off and then continued, "But if she's got to take a few days, then just come on back here." Big Mac nodded at his instructions, then went down the stairs, out of the house, and set off for Ponyville. Again, it was a typical walk with nothing much happening. As a matter of fact, the most interesting thing that happened really was that the saddle slid a little, and Big Mac had to stop and adjust it up on his back. Other than that, it was boring all the way down to the town square. On the other hand, Ponyville was burst with activity today. It was a Friday, a payday, and many things were up for sale on the market today. The market smells wonderful, and Big Mac had some extra bits that he could spend on a fresh apple pie or something sweet like that, but he didn't really have the time, so he decided against it. The Carousel Boutique was an unmistakable construction in Ponyville, and it being the only saddle and saddle repair shop in Ponyville, of course, Big Macintosh had been there before. It was conveniently placed too, and thus it didn't take him long to get there. Rarity had a big sign up on the front door that read, so Big Mac opened the door. Rarity had a big sign up on the front door that read open, so Big Mac opened the door and let himself in. It was nice and cool inside, and it smelled of air freshener, but the lobby was empty. Big Mac walked up to the desk and rang the little bell that was sitting atop it. As soon as he did, he heard a familiar voice chime, "Coming," from the other room. Shortly after, the beautiful white unicorn that was Rarity came out of the room with a cheery smile on her face. She was wearing her trademark red glasses and had some measuring tape around her neck. "Hi there, Big Macintosh," she greeted him as she went behind the desk. "What can I do for you?" She took notice of his saddle and chimed in before he could answer. "Let me guess, you need a repair?" "Yes, ma'am," Big Macintosh replied, and then moved sideways so that he could dump the saddle over onto the desk. Before he could dump it off, though, he felt a tingling sensation of magic and looked to see Rarity lifting it off of him. She lifted it off of his back and then sat it down on the desk in front of her. Rarity began to observe the saddle and looked it all over, scribbling in her little notebook as she did so. "Loose threads," she commented quietly, mostly to herself. "Some mild discoloration under, let's see here. Yes, dry leather patches and torn material here." She some more into her notebook and then made one last glance over the the saddle. She smiled at him briefly and said, "Not to worry, I can fix this." She flipped the saddle around just to make sure that she hadn't missed anything on the opposite side and finished. Partly to herself, "Yes, I can fix this in no time." She lifted up with her magic and set off towards the room which she had just come out of. She stopped just before she entered into it and looked back at him.
This won't take me long, dear, so you're welcome to stay. Make yourself comfortable here, or if you like, you can come back here and work my magic. Big Mac smiled at her hospitality and got up and followed her into the other room, where he watched her place the saddle down onto a counter in the middle of an assortment of materials. He took a seat and watched as Rarity went to work on the old saddle, fixing it up what seemed like no time at all. Sitting there and watching her work was way more interesting than just sitting and staring at the wall back in the lobby. Suddenly even Rarity sought him for help. Big Macintosh, dear, she said as she kept focus on some faded spots. Can you please hand me that brown paint over there, the dark brown one? Happy to help, Big Mac stood up and gathered up the brown paint that she had indicated in his hoof and then gave it to her. She thanked him, and then Big Mac watched as she intricately started to paint a discolored spot on the saddle. He was amazed at how she was able to make the saddle look just like new just by painting it, also at how much passion and love she seemed to put into her work. After she had finished painting in the discolored spots, Rarity went to tackle the loose threads. She cut those that were hanging off and down, then pulled some of the same colored threads out and began to gently stitch them back in, patting each one down gently as she did so. Again, even though it took a little time, Rarity finished up and was able to make it look as though the saddle had never had a loose thread in all of its life. Finally, she set to work working on the torn material. There were some pretty nasty gashes on the saddle, apparently from being shoved into the very back of the closet. It wouldn't be too terrible for her to repair, but it would take a little bit of time. She set to work trying to stitch it up, but eventually ran out of thread. Her hooves were pressed flat against the partially stitched hole, holding it down, and she was magically preoccupied with holding the needle in place. For if she cut the thread at this point and allowed it to fall, the stitching would pop out and reverse back through what had already been stitched. She hated to ask him for all of this, but she really had no other option. Normally she would have asked Sweetie Belle to help her, but she was making up a missed test in school right now. Big Macintosh, dear, she said to him once more, can you please get me a roll of thread? This color right here. She stepped aside just slightly so that he could see the color of the thread. It's in the drawer right over there. She nodded her head towards it. Knowing that she was kind of in a hurry to get it, Big Mac absentmindedly pulled the drawer open and picked up the roll with his mouth. He brought it over to Rarity, and she too, without thinking and still unable to take her hooves away, dramatic, went to take the spool from his mouth. Her teeth clamped onto it, and her lips came dangerously close to his. At that exact moment, they both realized what they were doing. Big Mac pulled his head away quickly, blushed and scratched the back of his head nervously. Rarity blushed deeply and looked down at the ground, and she cleared her throat when Big Mac backed away from her. Thankfully enough to Big Mac, though, Rarity seemed to be done asking for his help. He had made things awkward enough, so he decided to just sit down and keep to himself and focus on the saddle as she worked on it. All was quiet for a few moments after that, but then he heard Rarity say yes. She pulled one final thread, then snipped the thread. That should do it. She clapped her hooves. She turned to him and smiled. Well, now that wasn't too difficult. She blushed when she met Big Mac's eyes and again looked at the ground. Well, she ran her hoof through her mane in a nervous kind of way. She didn't really want Big Mac to leave. She rather enjoyed his presence. Rarity turned back around, and as she did, her tail whipped aside and sent one of the spools flying. She huffed and mumbled something under her breath and then bent over to retrieve the spool. When she did so, though, her tail flipped over to the side without her noticing, allowing Big Mac to the perfect view. Time once more seemed to slow down to him as he took notice of her beautiful body and her perfect genitals. She looked so smooth, so tight, and so ready. As a stallion, Big Macintosh just couldn't help but look on. Soon, though, he started to do more than look on. Thoughts very dirty and very cruel, thoughts that made him feel so very low, started to creep into his mind. He imagined doing things to her, things exactly like he had done with Applejack and with Twilight, his love. Oh, how he wished she would turn around, see him, and slug him across the face as hard as she possibly could. The exact opposite of that happened, though. Rarity stood back up to her regular posture, flipped back around, and didn't take notice of him until she placed the spool back up onto the desk. When she saw his eyes, though, and the stare that was there, and the desire that was deep within them, she blushed very deeply, pinned her ears in the most extreme embarrassment, and bit her bottom lip. It wasn't only his eyes, either. No, it was also his semi-erect penis that he seemed to be oblivious to. Seeing the way she reacted, and knowing that she knew what he had been doing, made him realize really quickly, though, and it was all he could do to close his little front legs in and extend his hind legs slightly outwards. It was no use, though. Rarity could still see him. What was even worse, though, for Big Mac, the most, but for them both really was the fact that he was getting increasingly harder. Oh my, she said and looked away. I guess you liked What you saw, Rarity asked slowly, rather quietly, then cleared her throat once more. Big Mac couldn't bring himself to speak and only nodded his head hesitantly. He knew that it probably would have been better to lie to her, but his demeanor changed when hers did. She walked slowly towards him and kissed him on the cheek. I don't mind, dear, she said to him. Rarity continued to kiss him on the cheek and eventually reared up and kissed him on the mouth. She hugged him. I haven't had this in a very long time. She was quiet for a few moments after that, but then peeked around to his side and eyed his penis. Your gesture is very sweet, but hardly subtle. Big Mac blushed even harder than he already had been. Rarity used her magic to take a single grape from the bowl that she had been eating from the table beside him and placed it into her mouth. Kiss me? She asked him quietly. Big Mac acted on impulse and also couldn't stop himself from obeying her wishes. When he did so, images of Twilight Sparkle came into his head and made guilt start to wash over him. The way Rarity kissed him, though, he couldn't help it when he cast those images and that feeling of guilt out of him. Before long, Big Mac felt an amazing sensation coming from between his legs and glanced down to see Rarity's magical aura wrapped around his penis, and stroking it in such a sensual way. He kissed her harder and even gave her some tongue, which she gladly gave back. Oh my, Rarity said quietly to him once more. The more she kissed him and the more she could feel her magic tricking him off, the more she wanted it. She kissed him just one more time, and then placed her hooves on his shoulders and pushed downwards gently, indicating that she wanted him to sit down. Big Macintosh got the message loud and clear, and allowed her to sit him down. He watched her in her movements afterwards. She knelt down on all fours and switched her magic from his penis over to him, gently pushing him back on him. Again, Big Mac allowed himself to be pushed back until he was sitting up and his cock was face to face with Rarity. The unicorn bit her lip and blushed as she stared at the massive thing before her. Soon, though, she did much more than stare at it. At first, she kissed it all up and down, starting at his head and then working down his shaft and then eventually down to his balls. When down there, she kissed them as well, but also placed them in her mouth and sucked gently on them and allowed them to roll into and out of her mouth. When finished, she went back to kissing his cock, but this time went from bottom to top. Big Mac reached down and stroked her silky soft mane as she then wrapped her lips around him. Rarity closed her eyes in pleased ecstasy as she continued to fillet him. She moved her head up and down slowly and moved her tongue over his head and all about the top of his shaft. She wrapped a hoof around the part that wasn't in her mouth and continued to blow him and also jerk him off quickly. The way she worked with her mouth amazed Big Mac, and it took a lot of will for him to hold back approaching the brink of orgasm so quickly. Eventually, Rarity pulled her head off of him and came up for a breath of air. She left her hoof wrapped around his penis and continued to tug on him rather quickly. When she got her breath, though, Rarity put her hoof down and went back to filleting him. This time, though, she took progressively more and more of him into her mouth. As she had been at first, she stayed around the top of his cock and up around his head. But after that, she started to push more and more of him into her throat. Eventually, even, she deep-throated him and went down all the way to the base of his penis, where she then circled her throat around and around his shaft. It was too much for Big Mac, and he thought he was about to come right then and there. Just before he could, Rarity pulled off and away from him, almost as if she was teasing him, and unable to hold him that deep in her throat. She could sense how close he was to orgasm, though, and finished off by once again wrapping her magical aura gently around his cock, and then stroking him upwards and downwards. The sensation that it sent through him was just too much, and Big Mac was about to come. He dropped his head backwards in exhausted pleasure, and it was only milliseconds from release. Rarity brushed her frazzled mane aside and quickly wrapped her lips back around his head and closed her eyes in ecstasy as she enjoyed his cum flowing into her mouth, over her tongue, and down into her throat. He tasted wonderful. As he emptied off into her, Rarity swallowed every little bit of it. When it felt like he had finished, Rarity pulled off of him and took one final swallow. She smiled as the warm, sticky fluid went down her throat. However, she miscalculated and was forced to close her eyes when she saw the last big glob that Big Macintosh had for her coming right towards her face, her glasses being the only thing shielding her eyes. When they made contact, she couldn't help but blush at loving the feeling of it all over her face, but then she kind of hated the fact that now she was so messy. She could feel that it was all over her face and all in her mane. Oh my goodness, she thought as she brought her hoof up and wiped some of it away from her eyes. This is going to be a mess to clean up. She opened her eyes and looked to see Big Macintosh breathing heavily and his cock receding back into his sheath. Rarity smiled both to herself and to him, and then stood up and gathered a towel from the nearby closet. She patted her mane off and then wiped the big glob of it off of her face and lips. Well, Rarity said, come along, dear, I'll ring you up. She took the saddle up with her magic and took it into the other room. A wobbly and exhausted Big Mac and tail. She went behind the counter and he propped himself up on it. Rarity began to tap some buttons on the register, but soon stopped and glanced over at him. Big Mac blushed and looked away from her. That was quite an experience, wasn't it? She crossed her forelegs on the counter and bent across it so that she would be face to face with him. There was a look of sensuality on her face, and the way that she was bent across the counter just made her look so sexy and vulnerable. Yeah, Big Mac said nervously and scratched at the back of his head. Rarity looked down at the freshly repaired saddle for a moment and then looked back up at him. I have a little proposition for you, Big Macintosh, she said, batting her beautiful blue eyes. How about I just make this one on the house and consider our adventure as my payment? Rarity giggled and ran her hoof down his chest. Now Big Mac really felt horrible. Not only had he cheated on Twilight, and not only he had gotten blown by her best friend, but now she was accepting his sex as a form of currency for a job that looked pretty difficult. What was he going to say, though? He merely nodded his head and blushed, partly from the embarrassment of it all, and partly from the guilt that was welling up inside of him. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly and nodded his head. That's good, dear, she said and kissed him on the mouth. Turn and I'll put this up for you. Big Mac turned and Rarity picked the saddle up and gently placed it down on his back. Have an excellent day, dear, she said with a sensual tone, and please do come back to visit me. She winked at him with the biggest, brightest blush on his face. Big Mac turned to leave as Rarity walked him to the door. He opened the door and then she turned him towards her. Maybe the next time you're here we can get a little more closer. She ran her hoof along his cheek and then kissed him there. She turned around and walked away from him, though she flipped him in the nose with her tail and walked back into the room where she had fixed the saddle in. Big Mac shuddered with lust as he watched her rump disappear around the corner. Even after she disappeared, he continued to stare on and had to slightly smack himself in the face to bring himself out of it. He shook his head a few times and then turned on and left the boutique, headed back for the farm. Meanwhile, back inside of the boutique, Rarity walked into the bathroom and checked herself out in the mirror. Ish, Rarity said as she saw her horrid self in the mirror. Her eyeliner was all runny from having deep-throated him. Her mane was all messy and had some staining in it from his dried cum, and then there was still some semen on parts of her face. She blushed deeply as she realized she had been talking to him and had kissed him even with some of his own semen on her face. She took a tissue from the nearby dispenser and dabbed the spots off of her face and then tossed it away. She looked back at herself in the mirror, used her magic to turn the water in the tub on, and then said to herself after a sigh, "Oh my stars, I'm a mess." She dabbed her hoof under the water to make sure it was warm and then flipped the shower on. I really need to get cleaned up before Sweetie sees me. The end. And I had a hard time recording this, apparently. Anyways, guys, thank you all for watching, listening, doing whatever the fuck you guys do, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.
100,000 stories have filled my head as I look for the answer in what I've read, secretly waiting for my life to change. And with this transformation